Welcome to Flip Your Sunday School class. Our mission: utilize modern technology and tools to more effectively help you to teach and lead your class, enabling it to become a close and dynamic group with vibrant fellowship and meaningful ministry. This week we begin our study of 1 Corinthians. This quarter we will cover the whole book of 1 Corinthians. To understand this epistle, a bit of background is necessary. Ancient Greece was made up of two land masses. An isthmus or neck connected them. Corinth, along with its sister city of Cenchrea, sat on this isthmus between the two land masses. The mainland of Greece was on the north. The Peloponnese, or southern Greece, was to the south. And Corinth sat between the Corinthian Gulf on the west and the Saronic Gulf on the east. Corinth was on the west side facing the Gulf of Corinth, and its sister city of Cenchrea, a few miles away, was on the east side facing the Saronic Gulf. All of Greece was in the Roman province of Achaia. To understand Corinth, it's important to understand its history. It had been a vibrant Greek city before 140 BC. It was destroyed, however, by the Romans in 144 after the Greeks rebelled against the Roman Empire. It was laid bare for 100 years until it was rebuilt by Caesar Augustus in around the year 40 BC. It became a colony of Rome, and by the time of Paul, it was a megacity by ancient standards. Corinth was a very important city. It was strategic in the empire. It had major economic influence in the empire. It was a metropolitan city. It had a very diverse racial and ethnic and economic diversity. People were very wealthy there. There were slaves there. There was everybody in between. It was a place where someone could move from being a slave to being a very rich person, given the order of things in the Roman Empire. It was a key port. It sat in the middle of shipping. Cargo and ships were carried across the isthmus. The isthmus was less than 4 miles wide. Sometimes the smaller ships would be taken along with their cargo across the isthmus. Other times cargo would be unloaded in Cenchrea, for instance, carted across the 4 miles to the city of Corinth and loaded onto a different ship, or maybe even on the same ship after the ship had sailed around the Peloponnese. Sailing around the Peloponnese was considered just too dangerous for loaded ships to do. The waters of the southern Peloponnese were treacherous and noted for being such, and that was the reason people would go to the trouble of dragging a ship or dragging a cargo across that isthmus there in Corinth. Because you had so many people there, and because of the history of the city, it had a very vibrant culture, though one that we would probably not consider to be always a great thing. Many pagan temples were there. Today you can see the remains to the temple to Apollos, which was a Roman temple and a Roman god, and a temple, there are remains to Aphrodite, which is up on the Acrocorinth above, on the mountain above Corinth. Many temple prostitutes were utilized in the worship of Aphrodite. There were both male and female prostitutes. Because you had lots of travelers, especially sailors with time on their hands, you can imagine what the city would have been like. It was dynamic. It was very influential because of its wealth and its strategic importance in the empire. It was very immoral and very opportunistic as people took advantage of other people there in that city. The gospel arrived in Corinth at the hands of the Apostle Paul. Chapter 18 of the book of Acts tells us about Paul's first visit to Corinth. It was during his second missionary journey and around the year AD 51. Paul ministered there in Corinth for about 18 months. This church was made up of rich and poor and slave and free. Here in this church, you had people redeemed from morally based lifestyles, people who were ex-prostitutes and Johns, and people from other immoral backgrounds. Culturally and linguistically, the city was diverse. You had Jews and Gentiles, Romans, Greeks, Egyptians, and people from other parts of the empire. People also had diverse religious backgrounds as they came into this church. Many had worshipped Greco and Roman gods. They had different understandings about who God is, what God is like, and even coming in, whether or not there was one or many gods. Corinth was also noted for being a divided church. It was a church because of all of these different reasons. So people were always coming into conflict with each other. It might be asked, why was it worth it? It addresses those kind of issues that rose in such a dynamic and volatile place. When one looks at Corinth and the church there, one might wonder, why is it worth the effort? It was kind of like the shipping that went through Corinth. Because of the great treacherous journey around the southern Peloponnese, it was worthwhile to go through the trouble of taking ships and cargoes and dragging them across that isthmus rather than sailing around. Because Corinth was such a strategic city, it was worthwhile starting a church there and spending all the time and energy that took to reach those people and care for those people, because they would end up spreading, because of the nature of who they were and where they were, spreading the gospel across the Roman Empire. And finally, it's worthwhile to note that 1 Corinthians is the longest book in the New Testament. There was a lot to be said there. Out of the richness of this great letter that Paul wrote to the Corinthians, we ourselves today in this time are informed and enriched in understanding God's ways, God's purposes, and even more especially how to do church, how to live out our lives as Christ's bride among other believers.